All right, so in this fourth learning objective, we're going to look at a very important event in history of, really civilization, but certainly in the U.S. economy, which was the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was a very deep and long-lasting economic downturn that took place from 1929 to 1933 was the technical definition of it. We saw that in the opening graph of these slides. We saw the big decrease in real GDP around the trend from 1929 to 1933, and we saw a subsequently very large increase above the trend following that, which was in and around the time of World War II, slightly after that, obviously. So that was in the mid-40s that was taking place. And so what makes this really interesting to study is that this had a really long-lasting effect on the structure of our economy and the politics. So a lot of things that we see today were byproducts of the Great Depression. So what are some of those things? Well, we've talked before in class about the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage was something that was adopted, as we discussed before, in 1938. So that was coming out of the Great Depression. So people were concerned that even if I was lucky enough to get a job, that it wouldn't pay enough. And so the federal government said, well, we're going to institute a minimum amount that you can pay a worker per hour. So as you remember, that started off at 25 cents an hour in 1938. And we had computed that to real numbers and found it to be, somewhere around $4 per hour today, equivalent, a little bit less than that. And so minimum wage laws were something that came out of the Great Depression. Social Security, which is, for the most part, benefits paid to retirees, also came out of the Great Depression. So much of our social safety net, as defined by Social Security, came from the Great Depression. It's also unemployment insurance benefits. Came out of the Great Depression. In fact, Wisconsin was one of the first states that paid such benefits from the unemployment insurance benefit system. So all of these things that are relatively common today that we think of are really byproducts of this very big downturn we had in economic activity. Well, how big was it? Well, the previous graph I showed kind of shows that. But in terms of the unemployment rate, it hit a peak of 25% just after, I think it was pretty close to 1933 when it hit that peak. And so think about that. 25% meant that basically 1 out of 4 people engaged in the labor market was unemployed. Now that's, quite a bit, right? So 1 out of 4 people was out of work. And so the decrease in real GDP associated with that was also fairly large, almost 30%. So real GDP went down by 30% over this period of time. So now, I wanted to give you some context. So these used to be numbers that were pretty hard to understand or wrap our heads around, because our experience has been unemployment in the, roughly 3 to 10% range. So thinking of something like 25% unemployment was really difficult to do. And real GDP would go down by, maybe 5, 10% at most. And so we weren't anywhere close to these big decreases in GDP. And we're staring at decreases of the same magnitude right now in this coronavirus pandemic. So I'm not trying to say it's the same as the Great Depression, but in terms of unemployment rates, it's going to be very similar. So, like I said before, we're at 16% probably right now, with a distinct possibility of going up beyond that, potentially reaching 20%, and we'll see if it gets somewhere around 25%. Certainly, I think 20% is possible, and so that is certainly a very high level of unemployment, akin to where we were in the Great Depression. And real GDP, I think, has already decreased on the order of 30%, and potentially more, as large parts of the economy have been shut down. So looking back at this Great Depression, there's a lot that we can potentially learn. So you talk to your parents, in particular grandparents, about their experiences in the Great Depression. And it was a very interesting period of time, right? So, and a lot of things that we have today are byproducts of that Depression era. So hopefully we have learned lessons from those periods of time to avoid another similar, very long-lasting downturn. So what made the Great Depression so unique was that it lasted for such a long period of time, right? So that's 4 years where we had very high unemployment rates. And when it sticks around for that long, it has a very large impact on people's lives. So at any rate, it's a very important event in history. I recommend reading up on it. If you haven't talked about it in a history class, it's very fun to read about some of the stories that came out of this era. So up next, we're going to go on to actually trying to understand what causes these events.